Hello everyone and welcome to the video. Today I have something a little different for you, as in this video I'll be giving you an overview of what my locomotive roster consists of as of October 4th of 2023. As I may have mentioned before, I've been collecting N-scale trains ever since I was 9 years old. When my collection started out, it only consisted of 2 locomotives, one BNSF and one Union Pacific. As of today, however, my locomotive roster is currently standing at a whopping 70 total locomotives, with 33 in my BNSF roster, 26 in my Union Pacific roster, 5 in my Amtrak roster, 5 foreign power units belonging to Norfolk Southern, CSX, and Canadian National, as well as a special unit belonging to a unique train set. In this video, I'll be talking about each of my locomotives in this collection, and talking about what I plan to do to them to make them more resemble their prototypical examples. So without any further ado, let's get into the video. So a couple pieces of admin before we get started here is, one, I'm going to go off script from here on out. So for the rest of the video, if you hear more ums, uhs, and lip smacking, I do apologize. And for the second bit of admin, I'm not really going to have a particular order in how I go about doing this locomotive roster, except for BNSF first, and then Union Pacific, and then Foreign Power and Amtrak. So it's not going to be any order of favorite to least favorite, or road number, or locomotive type. I'm just going to go in a random order, starting with each railroad type. So BNSF first, UP next, Foreign Power after that, and Amtrak as well. And that will be the order of the day. So without any further delay, let's get started. So one final piece of admin while I have the helicopter noise outside. I do apologize if you hear an excess of helicopter noises. I do live on a military base, so there is going to be a lot of that. I'll try to keep it as contained as I can. I'll try using noise reduction in post-edit. So if any of that slips through the cracks, I do apologize. So to start with, we have a -9 here. We have the BNSF -9 number 966. This locomotive came with one of the earlier -9 runs on offer from ScaleTrains' Operator Series. This locomotive has Heritage 1 paint scheme with an ATSF red walkway. And although it is an operator locomotive, so it doesn't come with the extra detail that your typical rivet counter does, it is a more affordable option if money is tight and you still want high detail, but there's also still a spare parts, or not spare parts, but a extra detail parts bag that comes with operator locomotives, so if you want to install those yourself, you are more than welcome to at your leisure. Back to this particular locomotive. This locomotive does not currently have DCC installed, but my intent is to put DCC on this locomotive sometime in the near future, as well as installing all those little detail parts that the locomotive came with. Up next is an EMD locomotive, a BNSF GP38-2 number 2081 from Bachmann. I haven't really been a fan of Bachmann lately, especially since high detail brands like Broadway Limited, ScaleTrains, and even many Athearn and Atlas options have been in the market. Bachmann has more or less fallen off the wayside for me, but with that being said, I am holding on to this one because I don't have very many Jeeps, and this is honestly a pretty good project locomotive. The couplers are busted on both ends of this locomotive, so I intend on replacing those with some more durable couplers, as well as repositioning the horn to its more prototypical position on the mid-left section of the body, and I do intend on weathering it to make it look like an aged Jeep. Next is another EMD locomotive. This one, from Kato, is BNSF SE70 Ace number 8574. Kato, in my opinion, is the best option for a low-budget modeler who still wants a fair amount of detail. Although I do gripe about the molds, how they can use an update to keep up with the other brands, all in all, Kato is a pretty good option for the budget modeler. But back to this locomotive. This model was not equipped with DCC, but I have since added a Digitrax decoder to it, and I also plan on weathering it and adding BLMA detail parts so that it looks more like the prototype. This little guy is BNSF number 3426, which is my first and so far my only SW1500 in my BNSF roster. I got this Microtrains locomotive a while ago off of a Facebook buy and sell group from someone who was also selling a GP60B along with it. Unfortunately, I wasn't fast enough to get that, but I was happy with this nonetheless. The guy I got it from had already put DCC on this locomotive, so I didn't need to worry about that, but there are still a couple of things I need to do with this locomotive. Apart from BLMA detailing and weathering, I would like to renumber this locomotive to number 3407 and de-stressing the BNSF lettering so I can justify having this locomotive around during the more recent years my layout will prominently be set in. My layout is set in modern day, sort of Southern California, not a prototypical location, but based, sort of inspired off of Southern California, like the Bakersfield, the Barstow area. Um, but anyway, so yeah, I want to renumber this so that it fits better in that area. And other than that, just heavy weathering. That's what I plan on doing with this guy. Next up is BNSF C44-9W number 5441. This Skeletrain's rivet counter model came out with a very unique paint scheme in that it has the front and rear of a Heritage 2 locomotive, but the midsection was replaced with a Heritage 1 body. This is one of only 2 locomotives that I know of with this paint oddity, with the other one being number 4331. This model being a rivet counter, there really isn't much I can do to further add to the realism of this locomotive. Skeletrains is obviously very known for its acute attention to detail and no holds barred. It will do everything it can to make their models as close to the prototype as possible, minus, the grime and the weathering, which is something I do intend to put on this locomotive. I do intend to weather it so that it looks more like its prototypical Big Brother. This model also does need a DCC decoder. The guy I got it from did not get the DCC equipped version, so I do have to get a decoder for this one. But when I do, I will be able to run this, and I will likely run this one very often. This Atlas Burlington Northern GP38 number 2177 is one of my only Burlington Northern locomotives currently in my roster. I wanted to get some older pre-merger power and bring it into the modern era, and that's exactly what I intend to do with this locomotive and the others in my roster. The real BNSF 2177 was painted in Heritage 1 back in 1997, so rather than repaint this one into its H1 scheme, I'm going to keep the Cascade Green scheme and renumber it to number 2160, as that GP38 kept its paint scheme all the way into 2021, though by then it was sold to Larry's Truck and Electric, LTEX, and moved to the Boneyard in Lordstown, Ohio. Speeding things along so I'm not repeating myself too much, here's another pair of Kato BNSF SD70 Aces, numbered 9370 and 8400. What is particularly special about number 9370 is that that locomotive was the first ever BNSF locomotive I got, and it's what started what is now my massive and continually growing collection. Apart from that, I expect to do similar weathering and BLMA detailing with these locomotives as I am with number 8574. Next up is another Kato locomotive, Burlington Northern SD40-2, number 7036. Like the earlier GP38, I expect to do a number of things to bring this locomotive into the modern era. Firstly, I am moving the horn into its more prototypical position in the middle left section of the locomotive's body. Next, it'll receive all the weathering and patchwork it needs to be denoted as an old BNSF workhorse. And since I like prototypical realism, some may say too much, this locomotive will be renumbered to number 1781. The reason I chose this number is because the real BN number 7036 was patched and renumbered to number 1781. It still has the BN Cascade Green paint as of July of 2023. And on top of that, of course, I will be adding DCC to this locomotive so that I may run it on my DCC-powered layout. In keeping with older power brought into the modern day, next up is this ATSF B40-8W number 530. The ex-BNSF-8s are disappearing on BNSF rails rather quickly, but I'll be keeping this one alive, although not as 530. In addition to heavy weathering, I'll be renumbering this one to number 552, as 552 still has its faded war bonnet scheme all the way into at least August of 2023. You may recognize this pair of Kato BNSF SD40-2s from their appearance on my tank car review if you saw that video. These too have older numbers that will need to be patched to better fit my modern era layout. In addition to the usual DCC installation, weathering, and BLMA detailing, BNSF number 6744 will be renumbered to number 1592, and the snoot nose number 6340 will be renumbered to 1881. As they kept their Heritage 1 paint schemes up until 2021 and 2020 respectively. Moving up to some modern day power, we have the Skeletrain's rivet counter ET44C4 number 3856. This was the first Tier 4 GEVO I added to my BNSF roster, and I added it fairly recently. You can tell this one came from one of the older runs, as the orange paint on this one is a little darker than it ought to be, but it's still an amazingly detailed locomotive. There isn't too much that needs to be done to this one, but I do intend to weather the locomotive so it looks like it's put a few thousand miles on its trucks. Back to Kato for a bit, we have BNSF AC 4400 CW number 5624. BNSF doesn't have very many AC 4400 CWs. In fact, they only have about 123 according to Picture Archives. So if you see what looks like a Heritage 2 GEVO, but in the 56 to 5700 number range, odds are fairly likely that it's an AC 4400. Like their close relative, the Dash 9, these locomotives are fairly old compared to the Aces and GEVOs they run alongside, but so that means this locomotive is going to receive a fair treatment of weathering, as well as the BLMA detailing that it'll need to look more realistic. Up next is ATSF SD40-2 number 5088. This locomotive, like its other SD40-2 counterparts in my inventory, will be receiving a heavier than normal dose of weathering, a DCC decoder, BLMA detailing, and a patch job. This locomotive's prototypical big brother was repainted into the Heritage 1 scheme, so I will be giving it number 1604 so that it retains its yellow bonnet paint scheme. Next is a couple more Kato locomotives. These are ES44ACs number 5749 and 5873. BNSF favored the ES44DC more than the AC, but they still have a few hundred of these in their roster, and as such, I expect to have a slim plurality in mine as well. As a short aside here, my BNSF roster is actually very much lacking in ES44C4s and ES44DCs, so until manufacturers start making those, my BNSF roster is it's going to be a little more Dash 9 heavy, at least for the time being, until they start making some more of those GEVOs later on. Anyway, as with my other models, these will need to be touched up with some BLMA detail parts and some light to moderate weathering as well. Up next is BNSF C44-9W number 660, one of 3 Dash 9s I got from the latest run of Scale Train's Rivet Counter Dash 9s. This is not only a very finely detailed locomotive, as rivet counters typically are, but this model is already patched and weathered to look like it's been on the BNSF roster for a few years, and the war bonnet scheme managed to survive those years. Although it isn't perfect. I will need to touch up the weathering on a few surfaces like the fuel tank and the trucks, and possibly a bit around the body as well, just to touch up those extra shiny bits that make it look like it's fresh off the assembly line at Scale Trains. But for what it is an amazing, very well detailed locomotive. While we're looking at Dash 9s, this pair of Katos are BNSF C44-9Ws number 4933 and 4972. I got these locomotives as a pair with DCC already installed and pretty much ready to go right out of the box. I do intend to make a couple of changes though. For one, there's the usual weathering and BLMA detailing, but also one of the locomotives has couplers that were installed by the previous owner a little higher than the NMRA standard and will need to be adjusted to mitigate the risk of uncoupling. Next up is Atlas BNSF SD60M number 9212, still in its BN Cascade green paint and already patched for BNSF, so that's one less thing I need to do. Though with this being an SD60M, it will need some love from an airbrush and chalks and paints and all that good stuff, as well as some BLMA parts. And the road number is a little dated for my timeline, so I'm going to renumber this one to 1473, as that one retained the Cascade Green scheme until at least 2022. Quick editorial note here, 1473 has 2 windows on the cab, so I changed my mind after doing a little bit more research. The new number is going to be 1406. Up next is another pair of locomotives. We have Scale Train's Rivet Counter BNSF ET44C4s number 3727 and 3740. What can I say about rivet counters that hasn't already been said? The detail on these locomotives is amazing, right down to the windshield wipers and the electronic bell. All that really needs to be done on these locomotives is some light to moderate weathering to add a few years of service life to these bad boys, and they'll be fit for the road. Here we have BNSF GP60 number 8734, still in its yellow bonnet scheme and already patched for BNSF. This model is from Lifelike. I've heard differing opinions about them over the years, but this model is pretty decent. Apart from the usual BLMA detailing, DCC installation, and weathering, the only thing that really needs to be updated is the number of the locomotive, and for the new number, I'm going to go with the number the prototype was replaced with, that being 192, as that locomotive kept the yellow bonnet until at least 2019. Back to Kato for a bit, here's BNSF SD70 Mac number 9863. This locomotive is a little dated, so it's going to receive a heavier dose of weathering than usual, as many Heritage 2 SD70 Macs are pretty faded these days. In addition to that, this locomotive is going to get a good amount of BLMA detail parts to liven it up a little. Speaking of older power, here is ATSF C44-9W number 605. Like the Mac, this locomotive will be receiving BLMA upgrades, and since this is a war bonnet, it will retain the scheme, but not the number. I'm gonna be changing this locomotive's number to one that has been seen several times throughout my High Iron series. This locomotive will be renumbered to number 683, as it still has that paint scheme to this day, and is one of the few ATSF war bonnets still around that is currently unpatched. While we're looking at war bonnets, up next we have a couple fake bonnets, BNSF C44-9Ws numbers 722 and 741. I would love to one day have a few fake bonnet locomotives with the 4-digit road numbers, the ones from 4700 to about 4720, because they're comparatively far less common than the 700 range fake bonnets. But until then, these will more than suffice. As typical with older Kato power, these locomotives will need a good amount of weathering and BLMA detailing, but the good news is, despite their age, neither of these will need renumbering. So here is the final pair of locomotives I have in my BNSF roster. These are in fact scale trains, but they're not rivet counters. These came from their operator series. As you can tell, there is a little less detail on these than their rivet counter brethren, but that can always be remedied with the operator series detail parts kits that these things come with, as well as the BLMA detail parts. Aside from that, I also do intend to give these locomotives a little bit of airbrush love as well. Going back to EMD for these last two locomotives, here's Atlas BNSF GP39-2 number 2711. This is the last Jeep in my BNSF roster before moving on to Union Pacific. Being a Jeep, this locomotive is going to be receiving weathering and BLMA detail parts indicative of switchers, like maybe even remote control antennas and stickers that denote the locomotive as having RC capabilities. Last locomotive on my BNSF roster, this one's from Athern. This is also likely one of the more unique locomotives on my BNSF roster, as I don't have others like it, and I believe it's going to be a pretty unlikely repeat in other people's collections. This is BNSF SD75I number 8277. This locomotive is going to receive some fairly heavy weathering, being a fake bonnet SD75, and I'm going to knock the 8 off the number boards, as SD75s today are all in the 250 to 300 number series to make room on the roster for some of the new ES44C4s. And although I don't believe there are any SD75Is still having the fake bonnet scheme, I am going to keep this one's fake bonnet scheme and only use it when I'm modeling the years roughly about 2014-15, probably. Well, that's everything for the BNSF roster, so let's move over to the UP yard and see what's in their yard. I'll go over my roster for that next. Starting off my Union Pacific roster is Intermountain SD40-2 number 3531. This is so far my only SD40-2 on my UP roster. The road number is a little old for my layout, so on top of the weathering and BLMA detailing, I will be renumbering this locomotive to the same number the prototype was replaced with, number 1782. I will also be updating the paint scheme on the locomotive so that it has a yellow sill stripe in place of its current red sill stripe, and the model will be redesignated as an SD40N. Next up is a few Kato units. This one is Union Pacific SD70M number 4837. Fun fact about this one is that this is my first Union Pacific locomotive on my roster. I got this one alongside BNSF SD70 Ace number 9370, and together these two locomotives started my collection. Like all my other Kato power, this one will be receiving weathering and BLMA parts, and this locomotive will also be receiving a yellow sill stripe in place of the red sill stripe, for the more modern paint scheme. While we're looking at SD70Ms, here's a pair of Union Pacific SD70Ms number 4000 and 4198. These are the last of my SD70Ms for the time being, but I do intend to add more to my collection over time. These two will be receiving the expected weathering, BLMA detailing, and sill stripe changes that the other one will have as well. Up next is a special rarity in my roster, one so long I had to back the camera up to get it all in view, is Athearn's 4884 Big Boy number 4014. I bought this from Athearn a while ago, but I haven't been able to run it because when I got it, it was basically dead on arrival. I still need to send this back to Athearn to get it looked at, but I suspect a gearbox issue that I am nowhere near experienced enough to trust myself to open it up and see for myself. If I can't get this fixed, I might shop around for a replacement from Kata or Broadway Limited. Who knows, maybe Scale Trains might make one too. Next up on the roster is Atlas Southern Pacific GP40-2 number 7623. Union Pacific doesn't keep older power around unpainted for very long, so it's pretty rare, especially these days, to see Union Pacific power still in their old Southern Pacific, Cotton Belt, Rio Grande, and Chicago Northwestern paint schemes. When I got this locomotive, it was equipped with torpedo couplers, so I removed those and plan on replacing them with knuckle couplers, as well as moving the horn, adding the UP yellow sill stripe, adding BLMA detail parts, and renumbering this locomotive to number 1500, as well as redesignating it as a GP40M-2. While we're looking at Jeeps, up next is Atlas Union Pacific GP39-2 number 1207. This is the only other Jeep that I have in my Union Pacific roster for the time being. That's that one and the GP40 that I showed you earlier. The horn needs to be moved, and this locomotive needs to be weathered, but some of the good news is that it already has the modern-day yellow sill stripe along the bottom of the locomotive. Up next, we're moving back to road freight locomotives. This is Kato AC4400CW, or C44AC in Union Pacific terminology, number 6735. Some interesting prototypical information about this locomotive is that it used to be a Chicago Northwestern locomotive before Union Pacific bought it and painted it in UP colors. Like the Jeep, this one already has the yellow sill stripes, but apart from that, it will still need a good amount of weathering and BLMA detailing before I can call it good. Here is a pair of Kato Gevos. This is Union Pacific C45 ACCTEs number 5542 and 5553. 5542 has already been weathered by its previous owner, but I may add to it to really make the weathering pop. 5553, however, does have a lot of work ahead of it before it's ready to go. Both engines do have the modern yellow sill stripe, and both will also need BLMA detailing as well. Up next is Kato Union Pacific SD70 Ace number 8453. This one does have a busted up front truck assembly. I'm not sure how it happened, but the front truck disconnected from the rest of the locomotive, so I gotta get that fixed, and then after that I gotta do the usual weathering and BLMA treatment before I can put this one back on the rails. This one is a Scale Trains rivet counter, as you can plainly see. This is Union Pacific C44-9W number 9647. Again, there's nothing I can say about rivet counters that hasn't already been said. This ex-Southern Pacific-9 looks absolutely stunning and is complete with both a patch job and the modern yellow sill stripe. All I really need to do to this one is give it a little tension from my airbrush and it'll be completely good to go. Next up is a Scale Trains Operator Series locomotive, Union Pacific C44-9W number 9698. As is typical with operator locomotives, there is a detail parts bag I can use to give more detail to this locomotive in addition to some BLMA parts. Apart from that, Union Pacific doesn't really use -9s all that much anymore, as they're pretty dated compared to their fleet of C45A CCTEs, so this one will need a good amount of weathering before it can go out on the rails. Oh, and I believe this one is not DCC equipped, so I will have to put a decoder in this one before I can put it on my rails. Here is a pair of Scale Trains Rivet Counter Series locomotives, Union Pacific C44-9Ws number 9568 and 9646. These two locomotives came from two different runs of -9s, with 9568 coming from the latest run. These locomotives look amazing as is, but both will definitely get some weathering. As on top of that, 9646 does also need a yellow sill as well. But other than that, honestly, I think I prefer 9646 over 9568. It feels like the yellow for that one is a little more realistic, and I see like a little bleed through of an old paint scheme kind of bleeding through the new paint. You can kind of see it here, but it's definitely more pronounced when you see it in person. Here's another pair of rivet counters for you to feast your eyes on. These are Union Pacific C45AHs, number 2670 and 2702. Being Tier 4 GEVOs, they will only need a fairly light amount of weathering, but other than that, these locomotives are pretty much ready to go as is. They're both DCC equipped. They look great. These came from the most recent run of Tier 4 GEVOs that they did, along with several of my BNSF GEVOs. And honestly, like, again, there's nothing I can say about rivet counters that hasn't already been said. Here's another pair of locomotives. These are from Broadway Limited Imports. They're AC 6000 CWs, or C44 ACMs in UP terminology, number 6888 and 6889. One gripe I have with BLI every now and then is that when they make a run of locomotives, they'll sometimes make them with numbers that are either sequentially like back to back or sequentially very close to each other, which not isn't necessarily a bad thing, but how often do you see locomotives on the same train with sequential numbers back to back, like 4001 and then 4002 and then 4003, so on and so forth? Probably not very often, but again, it's not really like a bad thing. So I digress. These locomotives are very well detailed and come standard with their Paragon 3 DCC and sound. All I really got to do with these is give them some heavy weathering because, as they are AC 6000s, they are pretty old. So they can use a little bit of love. Up next is another Broadway Limited locomotive. This is SD70AH number 9054. A lot of people have been dissing. Like I've heard a lot of people like dissing Broadway Limited for a variety of reasons. But personally speaking, I've never really had a problem with BLI products. They're very good quality locomotives. The rolling stock, the few that I have, are really nice. They roll really smoothly. I've never had a problem with BLI products that I haven't been able to identify as being a strictly BLI problem. Any problem I'd have would be something that had to do with a particular track on my layout or a particular issue otherwise not exclusively related to my Broadway Limited stuff. So when people say that they don't like Broadway Limited, I mean, I respect people's opinions, but I'm not really sure why. But that's just my personal experience. If people have dour experiences with BLI, I'm sure they come at it with their own nuanced reasons. But anyway, I digress. As you can probably see, my Union Pacific roster is definitely more modern than my BNSF roster. So there isn't really much I need to do to this one apart from light to moderate weathering and the occasional BLMA details. Other than that, it's a pretty solid locomotive. Going back to Kato for this one, here is Union Pacific SD70M number 1979. A few of you may already know this about my collection, but I have a rule when it comes to collecting specialty liveries like this WR1 locomotive. The rule basically boils down to if I see it in person or live on Virtual Railfan without scrolling back to see it, I can buy it. I saw this one on the Tehachapi Loop as the middle helper on a mixed freight train about 2 years ago, and when Kato announced it, I knew I had to get it. Apart from BLMA detailing and light weathering, there isn't really much I need to do to this one because Union Pacific, or most railroads in general, tend to keep their specialty units fairly clean. And when I saw this one, I actually saw that even the trucks and the fuel tank were pretty clean, so there isn't too much I need to do to this one, but I can give it the lightest of light weathering. Back to BLI for the rest of this collection. Up next is Union Pacific SD70 Ace number 1988, aka the Katy Heritage Unit. This one I did not personally see, but my dad did get to see it in person, and that is my one exception to the rule. So if my dad sees it in person and shows me photos and videos of it, I can add it to my collection as well. So that's why I have this one, and when someone ever makes it, I can get the BNSF Golden Swoosh as well. Like the one locomotive, all that really needs to be done on this one is a couple of BLMA details and some light weathering. Because, again, the heritage units like this one, the railroads try to keep a little cleaner than the rest of the fleet. Next up is Union Pacific SD70 Ace number 1982, aka the Missouri Pacific or MOPAC Heritage Unit. I saw this one about 9 years ago in 2014 just north of Mojave on its way through the Tehachapi Pass. I believe I was on my way home from a baseball tournament in Vegas when I saw it. As is typical with special units, all this one needs is some minor BLMA detailing and light weathering. Like I said, it doesn't need that much grime except for maybe on the trucks and the fuel tank, because these units are generally kept clean to the rest of the fleet. Next is actually, you know what? Last for my Union Pacific roster is Union Pacific SD70AH number 1943, aka the Armed Forces Heritage Unit, or the Spirit of the Union Pacific. I saw this one by pure chance a couple years ago in Stockton, California, while I was riding an Amtrak train back to my hometown while I was on leave. I saw it stopped at a red and lashed up with what I think was a Cotton Belt GP60 number 1004 and a few other UP locomotives. You may be noticing a theme with my special units in that, with the exception of the We Are 1 unit from Kato, these special locomotives are all made by Broadway Limited. I try to only get the special units from brands known for exceptional detail. That's why I don't yet have Union Pacific number 1989, even though it was featured in a High Iron episode, the Rio Grande Heritage, because when I saw that, that was long after those went out of stock. So I still have to get that one. But anyway, back to this one. All this one needs, like I said before, is just some minor BLMA detailing and light weathering, and it'll be good to go. Moving on to foreign power, we begin with some Kato units. This is CSX ES44DC number 5407. This is the only CSX unit in my roster for now, but I do intend to get more as time goes on. Not really much to say about this one. It is a Kato unit, so it will need BLMA detailing and some moderate weathering, but I did install a DCC decoder on it. I believe it's Digitrax. Heading north of the border, we have a pair of Canadian National ES44ACs, or as Canadian National calls them, EF644Ps, number 2899 and 2930. These are going to need the usual BLMA and weathering treatment that Katos would normally get, and if I'm not mistaken, I'll need to add decoders to these as well. Heading back to the States now, we have another pair of Gevos from Broadway Limited. These are Norfolk Southern ES44ACs, number 8132 and 8140. They will need similar weathering treatment, but they are already equipped with DCC and sound as per the Paragon 3 that these came with. Moving on to the Amtrak station, here are a couple of Kato units that will need some airbrush and BLMA detailing. These are P42 DCs number 60 and 169. I would like to get more of these so I have a wider selection of Amtrak locomotives to choose from, but I started building up my Amtrak fleet pretty late in the game, and these were the first two I was able to get my hands on that didn't have a special paint scheme to them. I also plan on getting some ALC 42 charges to add to the fleet as well. Up next is Kato P42DC number 203. This is the Operation Lifesaver special locomotive. You may notice this one from my channel's intro for every video. That one is the second unit on one of the northbound Coast Starlights that showed up here about a year and a half ago. This one will be receiving some light weathering as well as some BLMA detail parts in the near future as well. Here's another heritage unit that showed up around my neck of the woods about a year ago. Is Amtrak number 160 P42DC. This is the Amtrak Pepsi can paint scheme. As you can see, the name is indicative that the paint scheme bears resemblance to a Pepsi can. This paint scheme was on the Dash 8s of Amtrak's fleet way back in the day. I managed to see this one about a year ago live on Virtual Railfan, and so I went ahead and got this one. And I'm going to do some light weathering and BLMA detail parts on this one as well. And for our last Amtrak locomotive, we have a Dash 832 BWH for Amtrak California, number 2051. I have always loved the Amtrak California logo. I've always had a particular affinity towards it just because that this is the paint scheme that I grew up seeing on Amtrak trains. I never really saw the P42s. I never really saw the Dash 8s for the traditional Amtrak fleet. So I was usually around the Amtrak California area, particularly the San Joaquin branch of that. So I want to keep this one. I want to do the usual weathering and BLMA detail parts on this one. And I'm going to get this one, and I want to try to build up a fleet of F59 PHIs as well. And to bring our time here to a close, I want to close off with the special unit, the one that belongs to a particular train set that was released by Microtrains, piecemeal style, one like about a car every month or so. This is an F7 belonging to the Our Solar System set. This set also comes with like 13 boxcars that have little light up panels. It's a really cool set, and I wanted to showcase this one as well. I'm not going to do any weathering on this one just because it's a specialty set that I don't really plan on doing anything like hyper realistic with because it's meant to be a novelty set. The only thing I do want to do is the front coupler is busted, so I do want to get that replaced. But other than that, that's pretty much it. Well, there you have it. That is my N-scale locomotive roster as of October 4th, 2023. This is a pretty big roster, but in some, depending on who you ask, it might be a little too small. I know I'm going to be adding much more to it in the near future. I have pre-orders coming in later this year and starting next year from Scale Trains, as well as some prospects. I'm getting some Broadway Limited stuff and some Athearn stuff, Atlas stuff. You know, there's a lot I want to get. So stay tuned for that. I will be posting updates about my locomotive roster whenever there's a significant change to the roster. Well, that'll be it. Thank you guys for watching and subscribe for more.